The most profound betrayal of our time is not the violation of human rights, but the very concept itself. After witnessing the collapse of Europe's civilized order and the emergence of stateless millions, I came to understand that human rights, as we conceive them, are not merely inadequate. They are a dangerous fiction that obscures the true nature of political life. The moment we speak of rights that belong to humans as such, we enter a realm of abstraction that abandons the concrete reality of political existence. Rights exist only within political communities. And the tragic irony is that those who need rights most, the stateless, the rightless, are precisely those who have been expelled from the very condition that makes rights possible. This is not a failure of implementation, but a fundamental flaw in our understanding of what it means to be human in a political world. Chapter 1: The Illusion of Natural Rights. When I arrived in America as a stateless person, I discovered something that shattered my faith in Enlightenment certainties. The moment you lose your citizenship, you lose not just legal protection, but your very capacity to have rights at all. The beautiful declarations of the 18th century proclaimed that rights are inherent to human nature, inalienable and self-evident. Yet standing in immigration lines, surrounded by the rightless masses of Europe, I saw the terrible truth. There is no such thing as human nature that guarantees rights. The stateless taught me that rights are not natural gifts but political artifacts. When the Nazis stripped Jews of citizenship before stripping them of life, they understood something that liberal theorists missed. Rights exist only where there are institutions to recognize and enforce them. The man who loses his place in a political community loses the very ground on which rights can exist. He becomes, in the most literal sense, superfluous, not because he lacks inherent human dignity, but because he lacks the political context that makes dignity recognizable and protectable. This is why the truly rightless do not appeal to human rights. They appeal for the right to work, to education, to residence. They instinctively understand that abstract human rights are meaningless without the concrete political framework that gives them substance. The dangerous myth of natural rights obscures this fundamental truth. Humans need politics not because they are rational or moral beings, but because they are political beings who can only realize their full humanity in relationship with others. Chapter 2: The Right to Have Rights. The most devastating discovery of my exile was not that human rights could be violated, but that they could simply disappear. When European states began denaturalizing their Jewish citizens, they created a new category of human being. People who were human but not citizens, who possessed life but not political existence. These people revealed the central paradox of human rights, that the fundamental right is not the right to life, liberty, or property, but the right to have rights at all. The right to have rights is the right to belong to some political community where your words and actions matter, where your presence is recognized and your voice can be heard. Without this fundamental political membership, all other rights become meaningless abstractions. The stateless person may be fed in refugee camps, but he cannot act politically. He may be kept alive, but he cannot live a human life in the full sense. This is why the human rights framework is so dangerous. It promises protection precisely to those who are most vulnerable to rightlessness. By focusing on violations of rights, we ignore the more fundamental problem, the exclusion from political life that makes rights impossible. The concentration camps did not begin with gas chambers. They began with the creation of rightless people who had been expelled from the human community altogether. The tragedy of human rights is that they emerge precisely when politics fails, when the normal protective structures of political life have broken down. But rights without politics are merely moral appeals to the conscience of those who hold power. They may occasionally inspire charity, but they cannot create the political conditions that make rights sustainable. Only political action, only the creation and maintenance of public spaces where people can appear before others as distinct individuals, can guarantee the conditions under which rights become real. Chapter 3: The Totalitarian Solution to Rightlessness. The most chilling aspect of totalitarian movements was not their brutality, but their systematic solution to the problem of rightlessness. They understood what liberal democracies refused to acknowledge: that masses of rightless people represent a fundamental threat to political stability. The totalitarian solution was not to restore these people to political life, but to eliminate the problem by eliminating the people themselves. Before the final solution, there was the systematic creation of rightlessness. Jews were not killed as Jews, but as rightless beings who had been expelled from the human community. The Nazis understood that once you make people politically superfluous, you make them literally superfluous. The camps were not aberrations, but logical conclusions of a process that began with denaturalization and statelessness. Think about your own political existence for a moment. What makes you confident that your rights are secure? Is it the Constitution, the courts, the police? Or is it rather your membership in a political community that recognizes you as a participant in public life? The rightless person has the same constitutional protections on paper, but lacks the political standing that makes those protections meaningful. This is why totalitarian regimes were so effective at creating rightlessness even before they created death camps. By destroying the political spaces where people could appear as distinct individuals, they eliminated the conditions that make rights possible. The destruction of political life preceded and enabled the destruction of human life. Rights disappeared not because they were violated, but because the political world in which they could exist was systematically destroyed. Chapter 4: The Bureaucracy of Compassion. The response to rightlessness in our democratic societies has been equally revealing and equally dangerous. We have created vast bureaucracies of compassion, international organizations, human rights agencies, humanitarian institutions that promise to protect the rightless while keeping them permanently outside political life. These institutions treat rightlessness as a temporary humanitarian crisis rather than a fundamental political problem. The refugee camp perfectly embodies this bureaucratic solution. People are kept alive, fed, sheltered, but they are not permitted to enter political life. They exist in a liminal state, neither dead nor politically alive, sustained by charity, but excluded from the public realm where they might act as political beings. The camp becomes a permanent exception to political life, a space where biological life is maintained but political existence is denied. This humanitarian approach is not merely inadequate, it is complicit in maintaining rightlessness. By treating rightless people as objects of compassion rather than potential political actors, it perpetuates their exclusion from the very communities that could provide the foundation for rights. The humanitarian worker and the rightless person exist in fundamentally different political worlds, and no amount of good intention can bridge that gap. The danger of this approach is that it allows us to feel moral while avoiding the political work of creating inclusive communities. We can donate to refugee organizations, advocate for human rights, and support humanitarian interventions without ever addressing the fundamental political exclusions that create rightlessness in the first place. The bureaucracy of compassion thus becomes a substitute for politics, a way of managing the problem of rightlessness without solving it. Chapter 5: The Decline of Political Judgment. What we have lost in our obsession with human rights is the capacity for political judgment, the ability to discern the particular conditions that make political life possible and to act to preserve or create those conditions. Instead of judging political situations in their uniqueness and complexity, we apply universal principles that abstract from the concrete realities of political existence. The human rights framework encourages us to think of politics as the implementation of moral principles, rather than the creation of conditions for human plurality and action. We become moral crusaders rather than political actors. more concerned with being right than with creating sustainable political communities. This moralization of politics is profoundly anti-political because it eliminates the space for genuine political judgment. Consider how you approach political questions in your own life. Do you begin with universal principles about human rights? Or do you begin with the particular conditions of your political community and the specific challenges it faces? The difference is crucial. Political judgment requires attention to particularity, to the unique circumstances that shape political possibilities. Moral judgment, by contrast, applies universal standards regardless of context. This is why the human rights movement, despite its good intentions, has contributed to the decline of political judgment. By focusing on violations of abstract rights rather than the concrete conditions that make political life possible. It trains us to think morally rather than politically. We become better at identifying violations than at creating the political conditions that would make violations impossible. Chapter 6: The Spectacle of Human Rights. The modern human rights movement has transformed rightlessness from a political problem into a moral spectacle. We are invited to witness suffering, to feel outrage, to demand action from our governments. But we are not invited to engage in the political work of creating communities that could include the rightless. The spectacle of human rights allows us to experience moral satisfaction without political engagement. This spectacle is particularly seductive because it offers a kind of political participation that requires no real political risk. We can advocate for human rights from the safety of our own political communities, demanding that our governments intervene elsewhere to protect the rightless. But this intervention inevitably takes the form of either military force or humanitarian aid, both of which avoid the real political work of creating inclusive communities. The spectacle of human rights also creates a false sense of political progress. We measure our political health by our concern for human rights rather than by the actual conditions of political life in our communities. A society that obsesses over human rights violations abroad while allowing the erosion of political spaces at home is not politically healthy. It is politically decadent. What we need is not more human rights consciousness, but more political consciousness, awareness of the conditions that make authentic political life possible, and commitment to creating and maintaining those conditions. This requires moving beyond the spectacle of suffering to the hard work of political construction, beyond moral outrage to political judgment, beyond humanitarian intervention to political inclusion. Chapter 7: The Recovery of Political Life. The alternative to the human rights framework is not the abandonment of concern for the rightless, but the recovery of genuinely political approaches to rightlessness. This means understanding that the problem of rightlessness is not a humanitarian crisis to be managed, but a political crisis to be resolved through political action. It means creating political communities that can include those who have been excluded, rather than managing their exclusion through humanitarian means. The recovery of political life requires, first, the recognition that humans are political beings who can only realize their full humanity in relationship with others. Rights are not abstract moral claims, but concrete political achievements that must be continuously created and maintained through political action. This means that the protection of rights is not a technical problem to be solved by experts, but a political problem that requires the engagement of citizens. Second, it requires the creation of political spaces where people can appear before others as distinct individuals, where they can speak and act in ways that reveal their unique identities. These spaces cannot be created through humanitarian intervention or moral crusading, but only through the patient work of political construction, the creation of institutions, practices, and traditions that sustain political life. Finally, it requires the recognition that political life is inherently fragile and must be continuously renewed. The conditions that make rights possible are not given once and for all. but must be created anew by each generation. This is the true meaning of political responsibility, not the protection of abstract rights, but the creation and maintenance of the political conditions that make human flourishing possible. The capacity for new beginnings, for political action that can create unprecedented possibilities, remains our greatest hope. Even in the darkest times, humans retain the capacity to act together in ways that can transform their political situation. This is not a right that we possess, but a capacity that we must exercise if we are to create a world where rights can be real rather than merely mythical. Conclusion. The dangerous myth of human rights has distracted us from the fundamental political task of our time, creating political communities that can include rather than exclude, that can sustain rather than destroy the conditions for human plurality and action. Rights are not moral abstractions, but political achievements that require continuous political work to maintain. The truly rightless are not those whose rights have been violated, but those who have been excluded from political life altogether. Only by recovering our understanding of politics as the creation of conditions for human plurality, rather than the implementation of moral principles, can we address the crisis of rightlessness that threatens our political world. The choice before us is not between human rights and no rights, but between genuine political life and its spectacular substitutes.